The mining station floated in the cold darkness of space like a giant metal beast with thousands of glowing eyes. Tom walked through the narrow corridors carrying his toolbox and thinking about the strange sounds coming from Section 7. He had worked on Epsilon 7 for 3 years now and knew every pipe, every wire, and every strange noise the old station made. But this sound was different. The station housed workers from 6 different alien species, each with their own needs and problems. Tom was one of only 12 humans aboard, and most days he felt like the others saw him as some kind of primitive creature who was good at fixing things but not much else. The Nereid workers needed special air that smelled like ocean water. The crystalline Vec needed bright lights and warm temperatures. The insect-like Bryn workers preferred dark, humid spaces. Everyone had their own section of the station, designed just for them. Tom stopped outside the life support bay and listened. The sound was definitely coming from inside. He opened a heavy door and stepped into the warm, humid air that the station systems pumped throughout the different sections. Massive pipes ran along the ceiling like metal snakes, carrying different types of air to different parts of the station. Red lights blinked on control panels, and the steady hum of machines filled the room. Near the center of the bay, Tom saw Kira working on one of the atmospheric processors. She was a Nereid, with pale blue skin that looked almost translucent and large, dark eyes that reflected light like water. Her people came from a water world where they breathed a mixture of gases that would kill most other species. She was the best engineer on the station. Everyone knew that, but she always worked alone because her section required special atmosphere that other species could not survive in. Tom had talked to Kira, maybe 10 times in 3 years. She was polite but distant, like most of the aliens. They did their jobs. He did his, and everyone stayed in their own areas. But he had noticed that she worked harder than anyone else, often staying late to make sure all systems ran perfectly. She took pride in her work, just like he did. The strange sound came again, louder this time. It was a grinding, scraping noise that made Tom's teeth hurt. He looked up at the ceiling where the largest atmospheric duct ran directly above Kira's work area. The duct was about 2 feet wide and carried the special air mixture that kept the Nereid section livable. If something happened to that duct, Kira and the other 3 Nereid workers would be in serious trouble. Before Tom could say anything, the grinding sound became a roar. One of the heavy mining robots that moved or through the station had somehow gone off its track. The massive machine, weighing several tons, crashed through the wall like it was made of paper. Tom dove to one side as debris flew everywhere. Sparks shot from broken electrical systems, and the smell of burning metal filled the air. The robot slammed into the main atmospheric processor with tremendous force. Metal screamed against metal as pipes twisted and broke. The main duct that supplied air to the Nereid section crumpled like a tin can, completely blocked by the robot's bulk and twisted metal debris. Emergency alarms began wailing throughout the station. Tom picked himself up on the floor, his ears ringing. His left arm was cut and bleeding, but he ignored it. Kira was trapped on the other side of the wreckage, and the atmospheric processor that controlled her air supply was completely destroyed. Worse, the duct that carried breathable air to her section was now sealed tight. Other workers began arriving. Vec, the crystalline being who served as shift supervisor, moved into the room with careful, measured steps. His body looked like it was made of living diamond, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like wind chimes. Behind him came Bryn, an insect-like creature with 4 arms and compound eyes that could see in multiple directions at once. NAL, one of the reptilian workers from engineering, slithered in on his snake-like lower body. They all stopped when they saw the damage. The robot had not just broken the atmospheric processor, it had completely crushed the main duct. Tom could see that the metal was twisted and folded on itself, creating a solid barrier that blocked all airflow to the Nereid section. Vec's crystalline features showed no emotion, but Tom could hear the concern in his chiming voice when he spoke to Kira. The universal translator made his words understandable to everyone, but it could not hide the worry. Kira was already starting to look pale, and Tom knew why. The air in the Nereid section would quickly become toxic without the constant flow of fresh atmosphere from the main system. Bryn clicked and buzzed, communicating with the station's central computer through his species' natural interface abilities. His compound eyes reflected the red emergency lights as he processed information. When he spoke, his voice was sharp and quick, like the sound of breaking glass. The news was not good. The atmospheric reserves in the Nereid section would last maybe 4 hours before becoming dangerous. After 6 hours, the air would become toxic. After 8 hours, it would be deadly. The backup systems had been damaged in the crash and were not working. NAL examined the wreckage with his advanced engineering knowledge. His reptilian eyes could see heat patterns and structural damage that others might miss. He moved around the twisted metal, taking measurements and making calculations. When he finished his examination, he coiled his snake-like body and spoke in the slow, careful way of his people. The duct could be repaired, but it would take at least 2 days to cut through all the debris and replace the damaged sections. They would need specialized equipment that was not available on the station. A supply ship could bring the necessary tools, but it was 3 days away. Even if they started immediately, Kira would be dead long before they could restore her air supply. Tom studied the wreckage while the aliens talked. He could see where the duct had been crushed, but he could also see something the others had missed. The duct continued beyond the blockage, running through a complex series of maintenance tunnels that connected different parts of the station. If someone could get to the blockage from the inside, they might be able to clear it without waiting for heavy equipment. He looked at the maintenance access panel near the floor. The opening was small, barely large enough for a human to crawl through. The duct system was designed for automated maintenance robots, not living beings. But Tom had worked in tight spaces before, and he knew the layout of the station better than anyone. The aliens were already making preparations for Kira's death, in their logical way. They had calculated the odds and found them impossible. Vec was composing a report to Station Command. Bryn was updating the work schedules to account for the loss of their best engineer. NAL was planning how to seal off the Nereid section to prevent contamination of other areas. But Tom was not thinking about reports or schedules. He was thinking about Kira, who was probably sitting in her section right now, feeling the air grow thick and knowing she was going to die. He was thinking about how she always stayed late to make sure everyone else's life support systems worked perfectly. He was thinking about how unfair it was that such a dedicated worker would die because of a stupid accident. More than that, he was thinking about the maintenance tunnels that ran through the station like veins in a body. He had crawled through many of them during repairs, fixing problems that the automated systems could not handle. The tunnels were narrow, dark, and dangerous, but they connected every part of the station. If he could get into the duct system, he might be able to reach the blockage. The aliens finished their calculations and began to leave. There was nothing more they could do, and they had other responsibilities. Tom watched them go, then walked over to the access panel. He knelt down and opened it, revealing the dark tunnel that led into the station's mechanical systems. The opening looked impossibly small. The tunnel beyond disappeared into darkness, and Tom could hear the echo of air moving through distant passages. Somewhere in that maze of metal corridors, Kira was running out of time. The logical thing to do was accept that she could not be saved. The smart thing to do was file a report and move on to other work. But Tom had never been very good at doing the logical thing. He opened his toolbox and began selecting equipment. A portable light, basic tools, emergency air supply, protective gloves. He would need a travel light, carrying only what was absolutely necessary. The tunnels were too narrow for bulky equipment, and he would have to crawl most of the way. As he prepared his gear, Tom thought about what the other species would say if they knew what he was planning. They would call it impossible, illogical, and dangerous. They would be right on all counts. But they would also be missing the point. Someone had to try, even if the odds were terrible. Someone had to care enough to attempt the impossible. Tom strapped on his equipment and took one last look at the wreckage. The twisted metal looked like the mouth of a mechanical beast, ready to swallow anyone foolish enough to enter. But beyond that blockage, Kira was waiting for a miracle. Tom was not sure he could provide one, but he was certainly going to try. Tom crawled into the access tunnel and immediately felt the walls close around him like a metal coffin. The space was barely wide enough for his shoulders, and he had to keep his head down to avoid hitting the low ceiling. His portable light cut through the darkness ahead, showing a tunnel that seemed to stretch forever into the bowels of the station. Behind him, he could hear voices in the life support bay. Vec was talking to Station Command, his crystalline voice carrying clearly through the thin metal walls. The shift supervisor was explaining the situation in his usual logical way, describing the accident, the damage, and the inevitable death of a Nereid engineer. Tom heard his own name mentioned several times, but he was already too far into the tunnel to make out the exact words. The tunnel system was like a maze designed by someone who hated anyone who might need to crawl through it. Every few meters, Tom had to navigate around support beams, electrical conduits, and pipe junctions. His knees and elbows were already getting sore from crawling on the hard metal floor. The air in the tunnel was hot and stale, filled with the smell of oil and ozone from the station's machinery. After about 50 meters, Tom reached the first major junction. 3 tunnels branched off in different directions, each leading to different parts of the station. He pulled out his portable scanner and checked the station schematics he had downloaded to his toolkit. The main atmospheric duct should be about 30 meters above his current position, running parallel to the tunnel he was in. Tom chose a tunnel that angled upward toward the higher levels of the station. The climb was exhausting, made worse by the heavy tool bag he carried and the limited space that prevented him from standing up. Every few minutes he had to stop and rest, listening to the sounds of the station around him. He could hear the hum of generators, the whisper of air through other ducts, and the distant vibrations of machinery that never stopped running. As he climbed higher, Tom began to encounter the first real dangers of the duct system. Chemical residue from the station's industrial processes had built up on some surfaces, creating patches of corrosive material that could eat through his protective suit if he was not careful. Electrical cables ran along the tunnel walls, some of them damaged and sparking. The air itself was becoming dangerous as he moved into areas where different atmospheric systems mixed together. Tom put on his emergency breathing mask when he detected the sharp smell that meant toxic gases were present. The mask had only 2 hours of air supply, which meant he needed to work fast. But working fast in a space this cramped was almost impossible. Every movement had to be planned carefully to avoid getting stuck or damaging his equipment. The tunnel began to narrow even more as Tom approached the area where the main atmospheric duct ran. He could hear air moving somewhere above him, which meant he was getting close to the working parts of the ventilation system. But he could also hear something else, a sound that made his blood run cold. Metal was creaking and groaning under stress, as if the entire structure was slowly collapsing. Tom reached another junction and stopped to check his position. According to his scanner, he was now directly below the blocked duct, but getting to the blockage would require him to enter the duct system itself, crawling through the same pipes that carried atmosphere to different parts of the station. Some of those pipes carried air that would kill him in minutes if his breathing equipment failed. He found the access point he needed, a maintenance hatch that led directly into the main duct system. The hatch was barely large enough for a human to squeeze through, and beyond it lay the most dangerous part of his journey. The atmospheric ducts were not designed for human travel. They were filled with moving air chemical sensors and automated systems that might not react well to an unexpected visitor. Tom opened the hatch and felt a rush of strange-smelling air flow over him. This was the mixture of gases that kept the Nereid workers alive, but was not safe for humans to breathe for extended periods. His breathing mask would protect him, but only for a limited time. He had to move quickly once he entered the duct system. Before entering the hatch, Tom activated his emergency communicator and tried to contact the life support bay. The signal was weak this deep in the station, but he managed to get through to Vec. The crystalline supervisor's voice sounded surprised and alarmed when he realized where Tom was calling from. Vec told him that Kira's condition was getting worse. The air in the Nereid section was already becoming difficult to breathe, and the other Nereid workers were starting to show signs of distress. They had maybe 3 hours left before the situation became critical. The station commander, Lex, had been informed of the situation and was sending a formal report to both human and alien authorities. More importantly, Vec told Tom that his unauthorized rescue attempt was causing problems. Station regulations required all personnel to follow safety protocols during emergencies. By entering the dangerous tunnel system without permission, Tom was violating several safety rules and putting himself at unnecessary risk. Lex had ordered him to return to the life support bay immediately. Tom listened to the order and then turned off his communicator. He had expected this reaction from the station command. The aliens were logical beings who followed rules and procedures. They could not understand why anyone would attempt something with such a low chance of success. But Tom was not thinking about rules or procedures. He was thinking about Kira, trapped in her section and slowly running out of breathable air. He squeezed through the maintenance hatch and entered the main atmospheric duct. The space was even smaller than the access tunnels, and the airflow made it difficult to maintain his balance. Tom had to crawl on his hands and knees, fighting against a current of moving air that threatened to push him backward. The duct was filled with obstacles that had not shown up on a scanner. Sensor arrays stuck out from the walls like metal spiders, monitoring the air quality and composition. Filter systems created narrow bottlenecks where Tom had to compress his body to squeeze through. Worst of all, some sections of the duct were coated with a thin layer of condensation that made every surface slippery and dangerous. Tom's progress slowed to a crawl as he navigated each obstacle. His breathing mask was working properly, but he could feel the strange atmospheric mixture seeping in around the edges. The near-it air made his skin tingle and his eyes water. He tried not to think about what it might be doing to his lungs if his mask failed. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, Tom began to hear a new sound ahead of him. It was a grinding, scraping noise that meant he was approaching the area where the robot had crashed into the duct system. The blockage was somewhere ahead, but he still could not see it through the darkness and swirling air. Tom's portable light began to flicker, and he realized that the strange atmospheric mixture was affecting his electrical equipment. He switched to his backup light, but it was much dimmer than the primary unit. The reduced visibility made every obstacle more dangerous and every decision more difficult. He continued crawling forward, guided more by sound than sight. The grinding noise grew louder, and Tom began to see debris scattered throughout the duct. Small pieces of metal and plastic had been carried by the air flow from the site of the crash. Some of the debris had sharp edges that could cut through a protective suit if he was not careful. Tom's communicator crackled to life with an incoming message. It was Bryn, the insect-like engineer, reporting that the situation in the near-it section was getting critical. Kira had collapsed at her workstation and was having trouble breathing. The other near-it workers were in similar condition. They estimated that everyone in the section would lose consciousness within the next 2 hours. The message also contained new orders from Commander Lex. Tom was to abort his rescue attempt immediately and return to the life support bay. If he did not comply, he would face disciplinary action and possible criminal charges for endangering station safety. The commander had decided that losing one human worker was preferable to losing one human worker plus 4 near workers. Tom turned off his communicator again and kept crawling forward. He understood the commander's logic, but he did not agree with it. The alien saw the situation as a mathematical problem with a clear solution. Cut your losses, minimize the damage, and move on. But Tom saw it as a problem that had not been solved yet, a challenge that required a different kind of thinking. The duct began to curve upward, and Tom could see a faint glow ahead. He was approaching the area where the robot had crashed through the station's hull. Emergency lighting was still working in that section, providing just enough illumination to see the full extent of the damage. What Tom saw ahead of him was worse than he had imagined. The duct was not just blocked. It was completely crushed for a distance of at least 10 meters. Twisted metal, broken machinery, and chunks of debris had created a solid barrier that looked impenetrable. No one of the aliens had given up hope of clearing it quickly, but as Tom studied the blockage more carefully, he began to see possibilities that the others had missed. The debris was not randomly scattered. It had a structure, a pattern that suggested weak points where pressure could be applied. More importantly, some of the larger pieces were wedged against each other in ways that created small gaps and spaces. Tom realized that the blockage was like a 3-dimensional puzzle. If he could figure out which pieces to move and in what order, he might be able to create a pathway through the debris. It would not be easy, and it would certainly be dangerous, but it was possible. He checked his air supply and found that he had used about half of his breathing mixture. That gave him roughly 1 hour to work before he would need to retreat or risk suffocation. 1 hour to accomplish what the aliens believed was impossible. 1 hour to save Kira and prove that sometimes the illogical choice was the right choice. Tom opened his tool bag and selected his first implement. The work was about to begin. Tom reached the blockage and immediately understood why the aliens had declared the situation hopeless. The twisted mass of metal and debris stretched before him like a solid wall, completely filling the duct from floor to ceiling. Pieces of the mining robot were wedged between chunks of broken pipe and shattered support beams. Everything was held together by a tangle of electrical cables and bent metal plates that had been compressed into an almost solid barrier. He pulled out his portable scanner and began mapping the debris field. The device showed him the density and composition of different sections, revealing which areas might be softer or more flexible than others. What he found was not encouraging. Most of the blockage consisted of heavy metal components that would require industrial cutting equipment to remove. But the scanner also showed him something else: small pockets of space where pieces did not quite touch each other. Tom selected his smallest pry bar and began working on the first piece of debris. It was a section of broken pipe about the size of his arm, wedged between two larger chunks of metal. He worked the pry bar into the narrow gap and applied pressure, trying to shift the pipe enough to create a larger opening. The metal groaned and scraped, but it moved slightly. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Every piece of debris he moved threatened to shift the entire structure, potentially crushing him or sealing off his escape route. Tom had to be careful about which pieces to move and in what order, like solving a puzzle where one wrong move could be fatal. His hands were already cut and bleeding from the sharp edges, even through protective gloves. After 20 minutes of careful work, Tom managed to create a small opening about the size of his head. He shined his light into the gap and saw more debris beyond, but also something else. There was a space, a narrow tunnel through the wreckage where some pieces had fallen in a way that created a natural pathway. The opening was tiny, barely large enough for a human to squeeze through, but it was there. Tom tried his communicator again and managed to get a weak signal through to the life support bay. Bryn answered, his insect-like voice crackling with static. The news was not good. Kira had lost consciousness, and the other near-it workers were in critical condition. The atmosphere in their section was now toxic enough to cause permanent damage. They had perhaps 30 minutes before the situation became irreversible. More disturbing was Bryn's report about the station's reaction to Tom's mission. Commander Lex had declared him missing and presumed dead, and was preparing to seal off the damaged sections to prevent contamination. Security teams were standing by to lock down the tunnel system as soon as they determined that Tom could not possibly survive. The aliens had already written him off as another casualty of the accident. Tom turned off the communicator and looked at the narrow opening he had created. Getting through would require him to remove most of his equipment and compress his body into a space that seemed impossible for any living creature to navigate. But humans had one advantage that the other species lacked. They were incredibly flexible and adaptable when survival was at stake. He began stripping off unnecessary equipment, keeping only his most essential tools and his breathing apparatus. The emergency air supply was getting low, showing less than 30 minutes remaining. Tom knew he would have to work fast once he entered the debris tunnel, with no room for mistakes or delays. Tom squeezed into the opening head first, pushing his tool bag ahead of him. The space was so narrow that he could barely move his arms, and the rough edges of broken metal scraped against a protective suit. He could hear fabric tearing as sharp pieces caught on his clothing, but he kept moving forward. The tunnel through the debris was like crawling through the throat of a mechanical monster. Jagged metal teeth hung from above, and the floor was covered with smaller pieces of wreckage that cut into his knees and elbows. Tom's light flickered and went out completely, leaving him in total darkness. He had to navigate by feel alone, using his hand to find safe paths through the maze of sharp obstacles. Halfway through the debris tunnel, Tom encountered his first major obstacle. A large piece of the mining robot had fallen in a way that completely blocked the passage. The chunk of metal was too heavy for him to move, and there was no room to work around it. For a moment, Tom thought his journey was over. But then he remembered something from his training about metal expansion and contraction. The station's heating systems created temperature variations throughout the structure, causing metal components to expand and contract slightly. Tom pulled out his emergency heating unit, a small device designed to warm food or provide heat in cold environments. He applied heat to the metal obstacle, concentrating on the joints where it connected to other pieces. As the metal expanded, tiny gaps appeared around the edges. Tom worked his pry bar into these gaps, gradually widening them until he could squeeze past the obstacle. It was a technique that none of the alien species would have thought to try, because their logical minds focused on moving or removing obstacles rather than changing their properties. Tom continued through the debris tunnel, his breathing apparatus showing only 15 minutes of air remaining. His body was battered and exhausted, and several of his tools had been damaged or lost in the tight spaces. But he could see light ahead, indicating that he was approaching the other side of the blockage. The final section of the tunnel was the most difficult. The debris had settled in a way that created a bottleneck barely wider than Tom's shoulders. He had to exhale completely and compress his ribcage to fit through the opening. For a terrifying moment, he thought he was stuck, trapped in the debris with no way forward or backward. But Tom managed to push through the bottleneck and emerged on the other side of the blockage. He found himself in a section of the duct that was still intact, with clean air flowing toward the Nereid section of the station. The blockage behind him had prevented this air from reaching its destination, but the delivery system beyond was still functioning. Tom activated his communicator and was surprised to get a clear signal. He was now close enough to the Nereid section that his transmission could reach their local communication system. A weak voice answered his call, speaking in the liquid tones of Nereid language before switching to the universal translator. It was Kira, barely conscious but still alive. Her voice was faint and strained, but she was coherent enough to understand what Tom was trying to do. She told him that she and the other Nereid workers were near death, their respiratory systems shutting down from the toxic atmosphere. They had perhaps 10 minutes before losing consciousness permanently. Kira also gave Tom crucial information about the duct system ahead. There was another blockage about 50 meters from his current position, a smaller obstruction caused by debris that had been pushed through the system by the airflow. If he could clear that secondary blockage, air would begin flowing to the Nereid section immediately. Tom checked his air supply and found only 8 minutes remaining. He would have to work without his breathing apparatus soon, expose himself directly to the alien atmosphere that was designed for a completely different species. The risk was enormous, but the alternative was certain death for Kira and her co-workers. He began crawling toward the secondary blockage, moving as quickly as the narrow duct would allow. His body was screaming with pain from cuts, bruises, and the strain of working in impossible positions. His hands were so damaged that he could barely grip his tools. But Tom kept moving, driven by the knowledge that for lives depended on his success. The secondary blockage was smaller, but more complex than the main debris field. It consisted of twisted metal strips and broken components that had been woven together by the airflow into a dense mat. The obstruction was flexible rather than solid, which meant it could be moved but not easily removed. Tom began working on the blockage with his remaining tools, trying to untangle the woven debris. His air supply ran out completely, forcing him to remove his breathing mask and work in the alien atmosphere. The Nereid air burned his lungs and made his vision blur, but he kept working. As Tom loosened the debris mat, he began to feel air movement around him. The duct system was trying to resume normal flow, pushing against the obstruction he was removing. The pressure differential was working in his favor, helping to pull the debris away from the blockage point. With final effort, Tom managed to pull away the last major piece of the obstruction. Air began flowing freely through the duct, carrying the life-giving atmosphere toward the Nereid section. He could hear the whistle of moving air and feel the current pulling at his clothes. Tom's communicator crackled with an incoming message from Kira. Her voice was stronger now, filled with amazement and gratitude. Fresh air was flowing into the Nereid section, and the toxic levels were dropping rapidly. She and the other workers were breathing normally for the first time in hours. But Tom's work was not finished. He still had to make the return journey through the debris tunnel and back to the life support bay. His breathing equipment was exhausted. His tools were mostly broken or lost, and his body was pushed far beyond normal limits. The trip back would be even more dangerous than the journey in. Tom began the long crawl back toward the main blockage, fighting against the flow of air that now moved freely through the duct. His vision was getting worse from breathing the alien atmosphere, and his movements were becoming clumsy and uncoordinated. Several times he had to stop and rest, struggling to remain conscious. The debris tunnel looked different from this direction, and Tom had trouble finding the pathway he had used before. In his weakened condition, obstacles that he had overcome earlier now seemed impossible. He got stuck twice in narrow sections, having to work himself free through sheer determination. Tom finally reached the main blockage and began the difficult process of squeezing back through the opening he had created. His damaged hands could barely grip the rough metal edges, and his exhausted muscles trembled with the effort of pulling his body through the tight space. When he emerged from the debris field and back into the main duct system, Tom collapsed and lay still for several minutes. His communicator was buzzing with incoming messages, but he did not have the strength to answer them. He had succeeded in clearing the blockage and saving 4 lives, but the cost had been enormous. Now he had to find the strength to complete the journey home. Tom lay in the duct system, gasping for air that burned his lungs and made his throat feel like it was on fire. The alien atmosphere was keeping him alive, but slowly poisoning him at the same time. His vision kept blurring, and strange colors danced at the edges of his sight. He knew he had to keep moving, or he would pass out and die in this metal tunnel far from any help. His communicator was buzzing constantly with incoming messages, but Tom could barely focus enough to understand the words. Through the static in his own confused hearing, he caught fragments of conversations. Kira was talking to someone, her voice much stronger now that she could breathe properly. Other voices were discussing his condition and arguing about what to do next. Tom forced himself to start crawling back toward the access tunnels. Every movement sent waves of pain through his battered body. His hands were so damaged that they left bloody prints on the metal surfaces, and his knees felt like they were grinding against broken glass. The return journey seemed impossibly long, much farther than the trip had been. The alien air was affecting his mind as well as his body. Tom began to see things that were not there, shadows moving in the darkness ahead, and lights that flickered and disappeared when he looked directly at them. Several times he thought he heard voices calling his name, but when he stopped to listen, there was only the sound of air moving through the ducts. Tom reached the first major junction in the duct system and had to stop to figure out which direction to go. The tunnels all looked the same in his confused state, and his portable scanner had been damaged during the crawl through the debris. He chose a direction that felt right and kept moving, hoping his instincts would guide him back to safety. The tunnel began to slope downward, which Tom thought was a good sign. He remembered climbing upward on his way to the blockage, so going down should take him back toward the life support bay. But after crawling for what felt like hours, he realized he was lost. The tunnel system was like a maze, and in his poisoned condition, he could not remember the correct path. Tom's communicator crackled with a clear transmission from Vec, the crystalline supervisor. The alien's voice sounded different now, filled with what might have been concern or respect. Vec was trying to guide Tom back to safety using the station's internal sensors to track his location. The supervisor had been monitoring Tom's progress and knew exactly where he was in the tunnel system. Following Vec's directions, Tom changed course and began crawling toward a different section of the station. His movements were getting slower and more unsteady as the alien atmosphere continued to affect his system. Several times he had to stop and rest, fighting the urge to just lie down and sleep. He knew that sleeping in this poisoned air would probably mean never waking up. As Tom crawled through the tunnels, he began to hear other voices on his communicator. Bryn was reporting that all 4 Nereid workers were now breathing normally and their vital signs were stable. The insect engineer's clicking voice carried what sounded like amazement as he described how quickly the atmospheric levels had returned to normal once the blockage was cleared. NAL, the reptilian engineer, was analyzing what Tom had accomplished. His slow, careful voice described the debris removal in technical terms that Tom could barely understand in his current condition. But the meaning was clear. Tom had done something that their computer models said was impossible. He had cleared a blockage that should have required heavy machinery and days of work. More surprising was the voice of Commander Lex, the station's Sternavian leader. Tom had expected anger and punishment for disobeying orders, but instead the commander's tone was thoughtful and curious. Lex wanted to understand how Tom had succeeded where their best engineers had failed. The commander was asking questions about human problem-solving methods and physical capabilities. Tom reached another junction and found himself looking at 3 different tunnels. According to Vec's directions, he needed to take the middle tunnel, but it looked impossibly narrow. The opening was smaller than the others, barely wide enough for his shoulders. In his weakened condition, Tom was not sure he could squeeze through such a tight space. But Vec insisted that the middle tunnel was the correct path, and Tom had no choice but to trust the alien supervisor's guidance. He began working his way into the narrow opening, using his elbows and knees to push himself forward. The metal walls pressed against him from both sides, and for a moment he thought he might get stuck permanently. Tom's damaged hands slipped on the smooth metal surfaces, and he could not get enough grip to pull himself forward. His body was too weak to push effectively, and the tunnel was too narrow to change position. Panic began to set in as he realized he might die just meters away from safety, trapped in a space too small for rescue. Then Tom remembered something his father had taught him years ago when they were working on machinery together. When you cannot push or pull, you use leverage and physics to do the work for you. Tom positioned his back against one wall of the tunnel and his feet against the other wall, then used his leg muscles to push himself forward like a spring. The technique worked, and Tom began making progress through the narrow tunnel. It was slow and painful, but he was moving towards safety. His legs were much stronger than his damaged arms, and by using them to push rather than trying to crawl, he could make steady progress even in his weakened condition. Behind him, Tom could hear voices discussing what had happened. The alien crew members were trying to understand how he had succeeded in clearing the blockage. Their analysis revealed that Tom had used techniques and approaches that none of their species would have considered. The use of heat expansion to create gaps in the debris was something their logical minds had not calculated as a possibility. More important was Tom's willingness to work in spaces and conditions that would have killed most other species. The aliens realized that humans had physical and mental capabilities that made them uniquely suited for certain types of problems. Where other species saw impossible obstacles, humans saw challenges that could be overcome through determination and creative thinking. Tom emerged from the narrow tunnel into a wider access passage that he recognized from his journey in. He was close to the life support bay now, perhaps only a few hundred meters away. But those final meters would be the most difficult part of his journey. The alien atmosphere had been poisoning him for over an hour, and his body was beginning to shut down. His vision was failing, and Tom could barely see the tunnel ahead. His hands and arms had lost most of their strength, making it difficult to pull himself forward. Several times he had to stop and rest, fighting to stay conscious as the toxic air continued to damage his system. Tom's communicator brought him a message from Kira herself. The Nereid engineer's liquid voice was filled with gratitude and amazement as she thanked him for saving her life and the lives of her co-workers. But more than gratitude, there was curiosity in her voice. She wanted to understand why Tom had risked everything for people he barely knew, especially people from a different species. The question was one that Tom had been asking himself during the long crawl back to safety. Why had he chosen to attempt something that everyone else considered impossible? Why had he risked his life for strangers who might not have done the same for him? The logical answer was that he should not have tried, that the risk was too great and the chances of success too small. But Tom realized that logic was not the right way to think about the problem. The aliens approached every situation by calculating odds and making rational decisions based on probability and efficiency. They were very good at this approach, and it served them well in most circumstances. But sometimes a logical choice was not the right choice. Humans had something that the other species seemed to lack, the ability to care about individuals even when it was not logical or efficient to do so. Tom had not saved Kira because it made mathematical sense. He had saved her because it was the right thing to do. That simple principle had driven him to attempt the impossible and somehow succeed. Tom reached the final section of tunnel before the life support bay. He could hear voices clearly now, and emergency lights were visible ahead, but his body was at the end of its endurance, and he was not sure he could complete the last few meters of his journey. The alien atmosphere had done serious damage to his respiratory system, and he was having trouble staying conscious. His communicator brought him the voices of the entire alien crew, all of them talking at once in their different languages. Vec was coordinating a rescue effort. trying to figure out how to extract Tom from the tunnel system before he collapsed completely. Bryn was analyzing the atmospheric damage and calculating how long Tom could survive. NAL was preparing medical equipment to treat him once he reached safety. But it was Kira's voice that gave Tom the strength to keep moving. The Nereid engineer was talking directly to him, encouraging him to complete his journey, and promising that she would be waiting to thank him personally. Her words carried a warmth and concern that Tom had never heard from any of the aliens before. Tom pulled himself through the final meters of tunnel and saw the access hatch that led back to the life support bay. The opening looked impossibly far away, but he forced his damaged body to keep moving. 1 meter, then another, then finally his hand touched the hatch release mechanism. The hatch opened with a burst of clean, breathable air that felt like the most wonderful thing Tom had ever experienced. Strong hands reached into the tunnel and pulled him out into the bright lights and open space of the life support bay. He was safe, and 4 lives had been saved because one human had refused to accept that something was impossible. Tom collapsed on the floor of the life support bay as soon as the strong hands pulled him from the tunnel. The clean air felt like ice water in his burning lungs, and the bright lights made his poisoned eyes water uncontrollably. He could hear voices around him speaking in different alien languages, but the words seemed to come from very far away. Bryn knelt beside him with a medical scanner, his compound eyes reflecting concern as he examined Tom's condition. The insect engineer's 4 arms moved quickly over the scanner controls, taking readings of Tom's vital signs and atmospheric poisoning levels. His clicking voice carried notes of amazement as he reported that Tom had survived exposure to Nereid atmosphere for over 90 minutes, something that should have killed a human in less than 30. Vex stood nearby, his crystalline body catching and reflecting the emergency lights in brilliant patterns. The supervisor's voice chimed with what sounded like respect as he spoke into his communicator, reporting to station command that the human maintenance worker had successfully completed an impossible rescue mission. Tom could hear surprise in the voices that answered Vex's transmission, as if the people receiving the report could not believe what they were being told. NAL approached with emergency medical equipment, his reptilian eyes studying Tom with new interest. The engineer had brought breathing apparatus designed to flush alien toxins from human respiratory systems, along with healing compounds that could repair some of the damage Tom had suffered. But more than medical concern, there was curiosity in NAL's slow, careful movements as he worked. Tom tried to sit up, but found that his body would not obey his commands. The alien atmosphere had done serious damage to his nervous system, making his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. But he was alive, and more importantly, he could hear the sound of air flowing freely through the repaired duct system. The soft whoosh of moving atmosphere told him that his mission had been successful. The bay doors opened, and Commander Lex entered with quick, decisive steps. The avian leader's feather crest was raised, and what Tom had learned was a sign of alertness or concern. Lex moved directly to where Tom lay, studying him with sharp eyes that missed nothing. The commander's voice carried authority, but also something else that Tom had never heard before, something that might have been gratitude. Lex spoke directly to Tom, asking him questions about his journey through the tunnel system and his methods for clearing the blockage. The commander wanted to understand exactly what Tom had done and how he had accomplished something that their best engineers had declared impossible. But the questions were not accusatory or demanding. They were genuinely curious. Tom managed to answer in a weak voice, describing his use of heat expansion to create gaps in the debris and his technique of using leverage and body positioning to work in spaces too small for conventional tools. As he spoke, he could see the alien crew members exchanging glances, communicating in ways that did not require words. They were beginning to understand that human problem-solving methods were fundamentally different from their own. The bay doors opened again and Kira entered, moving slowly but steadily on her own power. The Nereid engineer looked much better than she had during the crisis, her pale blue skin having regained its healthy, translucent glow. Her large, dark eyes were fixed on Tom with an expression he had never seen from any of the aliens before, an expression of pure gratitude mixed with wonder. Kira approached Tom and knelt beside him, speaking in her liquid voice that the universal translator converted into words of thanks. But beyond the formal gratitude, she asked the same question that Commander Lex had posed. Why had Tom risked everything for people he barely knew? What had driven him to attempt something that everyone else considered hopeless? Tom looked around at the alien faces surrounding him and realized that this was the most important question he would ever be asked. His answer would help these logical, rational beings understand something fundamental about human nature that they had never encountered before. He took a deep breath of clean air and began to explain. He told them that humans did not always make decisions based on logic or probability calculations. Sometimes they acted on principles that were more important than mathematical certainty. The principle that every life had value, regardless of species or circumstances. The principle that someone should always try to help when others were in danger, even if the attempt seemed hopeless. Tom explained that humans had evolved as social creatures who survived by working together and caring for each other. This instinct to help others had become so deeply embedded in human nature that it overrode purely logical thinking in crisis situations. Where the alien saw an impossible mathematical problem, Tom had seen people who needed help. Vec's crystalline features showed what might have been confusion as he processed this information. His logical mind had difficulty understanding how emotional responses could lead to better outcomes than calculated decisions. But the evidence was undeniable. Tom had succeeded where their rational approach had failed. The supervisor began asking detailed questions about human decision-making processes and social evolution. Bryn's compound eyes studied Tom with new intensity as the insect engineer tried to understand how a logical behavior could produce logical results. His clicking voice carried notes of fascination as he described Tom's actions to the station's computer systems, updating their databases with information about human capabilities that had never been recorded before. NAL coiled his serpentine body in a posture that indicated deep thought among his species. The reptilian engineer had always believed that methodical, systematic approaches were superior to impulsive actions. But Tom's success had demonstrated that sometimes quick, intuitive decisions could accomplish what careful planning could not. Commander Lex listened to Tom's explanation with growing understanding. The avian leader had initially seen Tom's disobedience as a violation of station protocols that could not be tolerated. But now Lex was beginning to recognize that human behavioral patterns might actually be valuable assets in crisis situations where conventional approaches failed. As Tom recovered enough strength to sit up, the alien crew members began discussing what they had witnessed. Their conversation revealed how profoundly the events had affected their understanding of human capabilities. They had always seen humans as primitive creatures who compensated for their limitations through stubborn determination. Now they realized that human traits they had dismissed as weaknesses were actually sophisticated survival mechanisms. Kira spoke about her observations of human workers during her 3 years on the station. She had noticed that humans often found solutions to problems that alien engineers missed, not because humans were more intelligent, but because they approached problems from completely different angles. Where aliens focus on optimizing known solutions, humans seem to instinctively look for entirely new approaches. The medical scanner showed that Tom's condition was improving rapidly. His body was processing the alien toxins more efficiently than Bryn had predicted, and the damage to his respiratory system was healing faster than expected. The insect engineer noted that human biology seemed remarkably adaptable, capable of surviving conditions that would be fatal to most other species. But the most significant changes were not in Tom's physical condition. They were in the attitudes of the alien crew members surrounding him. For the first time since humans had joined the galactic community, a group of aliens was seeing humanity not as junior partners who needed guidance, but as equals who brought unique and valuable capabilities to any cooperative effort. Commander Lex activated the station's communication system and began composing a detailed report about the incident. But instead of focusing on mechanical failure and its resolution, the commander emphasized Tom's actions and their implications for understanding human contributions to mixed species operations. The report would be transmitted to government officials and military leaders across multiple worlds. Vec added his own observations to the report, describing how Tom's willingness to attempt the impossible had saved 4 lives and prevented a major station emergency. The crystalline supervisor recommended that human personnel be given greater responsibilities in crisis response situations based on their demonstrated ability to succeed where logical approaches failed. Bryn contributed technical analysis, showing that Tom's methods had been not just successful, but actually more efficient than conventional approaches that had been considered. The debris removal technique using heat expansion and leverage had cleared the blockage in a fraction of the time that heavy machinery would have required. Assuming such machinery could have been brought to location at all, NAL provided engineering assessments that proved Tom's actions had been based on sound scientific principles, even though they had not been calculated in advance. The reptilian engineer's analysis showed that human intuitive problem-solving often arrived at optimal solutions through processes that were too complex for conventional mathematical modeling. As the reports were completed and transmitted, Tom realized that something fundamental had changed in his relationship with the alien crew members. They no longer saw him as simply a maintenance worker who was good at fixing broken equipment. They now understood that humans possess capabilities that could be invaluable in situations where conventional wisdom was inadequate. Kira helped Tom to his feet as his strength returned, her touch gentle but steady. The Nereid engineer told him that she would never forget what he had done, not just a physical act of clearing the blockage, but the demonstration that someone could care enough about strangers to risk everything for their welfare. Her words carried deeper meaning than simple gratitude. The other Nereid workers arrived to thank Tom personally, their liquid voices expressing amazement at his actions. They had never expected that a member of another species would risk his life to save theirs, especially when his own people would have considered the attempt foolish and unnecessary. Their gratitude was profound and genuine. Commander-elects approached Tom with an official commendation for exceptional service under dangerous conditions. But more important than the formal recognition was the commander's statement that station protocols would be revised to give human personnel greater authority to make independent decisions during emergencies. The rigid adherence to predetermined procedures would be balanced with recognition that sometimes the best solutions came from unexpected directions. As the immediate crisis passed and normal operations resumed, Tom returned to his regular maintenance duties. But everything was different now. The alien crew members sought his opinions on problems they had previously handled without consultation. They asked questions about human perspectives and approaches that had never seemed relevant before. Tom realized that he had done more than save 4 lives and clear a blocked duct. He had opened a door to better understanding between species that had been working together but not truly cooperating. The impossible rescue had become a bridge between different ways of thinking and solving problems. The incident would be remembered long after the damaged equipment was repaired and the station returned to normal operations. It would be studied as an example of how different species could learn from each other and become stronger through cooperation. And it would stand as proof that sometimes the most important victories came not from superior technology or overwhelming force, but from simple human determination to help others, no matter what the cost.